ago, we heard from Jack Atkins at Regen talking about location of offshore wind and making the case for putting more wind out to the west, just to balance the system and to manage this kind of co-location of high pressure and this kind of thing. But offshore has got quite a strong case behind it, and notwithstanding the recent auctions and so forth, at least we have deployed quite a lot of that in the last 5-10 years. But this week, just to make sure you're in the right room, we welcome James Rowbottom from the Trade Association Renewable UK, and he's head of onshore wind, which I guess has been a bit of a lonely job for the last.
Head of policy.
Sorry. Oh, well, amongst his multiple things. But James has worked in policy and analysis for a decade, but not always in the renewable sector. But we'll let that slide. Previously, sustainability and climate change lead at the IET. So you were leading the program of work on onshore wind, okay, which is to realise, now this is interesting, 2024 has nearly started, to realise the industry's ambition of 30 gigawatts of onshore wind by 2030. So no mean feat there. So my understanding is your role covers advocacy, policy, planning, community, environment, and it says on my piece of paper, everything else that gets thrown in your direction. And I also see you're currently seeking a senior policy advisor to address barriers posed by aerospace and defence issues.
I am indeed. I've just actually.
So if there's anybody, it's too late.
We definitely need people.
So having said that, I'm going to disable the speaker so we don't hear the beeps every time somebody joins, if I can do that. And I'm going to hand over to James and say, sorry, I moved.
That's all right.
And yeah, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me. It is an absolute honour to be here. That's going to carry on going, I reckon. Sorry to the people on the camera. It does look like it's sort of secret filming, as though I'm going to get caught and I'm going to have to give up my job as England manager. So I will move, I'm afraid, on the camera, because it'd be nice to talk to all of you. So we're here today to talk about what we need to do to build more onshore wind in the UK. I hope it's going to be fun and engaging. I'm really keen, if you have a question, just stick your hand up. We do a lot of community engagement for onshore wind, so tell me, challenge me, ask me a question at the right time. Qualify it. I am a politics and I'm a lobbyist and I'm an advocacy person. I'm not an engineer and I'm not an economist. I will do my best to muddle through, but I have great colleagues who can help you out with particular questions on that. That's my caveat. Who am I? Who am I to come and talk to you about onshore wind? As you said, I'm head of policy at Renewable UK. We're the trade association that represents onshore wind, offshore wind, tidal, not solar. That's our friends Solar Energy UK, but we sit in the same office, so we're good pals. And yeah, so as we've sort of discussed, I cover those things to do with planning, environment, community, and pretty much anything else that gets thrown my way. So this will be quite a broad look at onshore wind, and we can get onto any sort of depth that you have got in the questions. It's very important to say I love wind. I love talking about wind. I love visiting wind farms. I love visiting massive wind turbines. That's the Haliade-X for anyone that's a turbine nerd. That's an offshore wind turbine, but that's in the port of Rotterdam. That's 12 megawatts. That's massive. I like offshore wind as well. We took some Defra spads out to see there. Some people think I like wind turbines too much, but I have a long history of it. That is, in fact, my great-granddad's windmill, and he was a miller. So I have legitimacy in that respect. Before that, I was at the Institution of Engineering and Technology, doing climate change and kind of policy work in that. And when I said I had legitimacy, though, and I realise it's pantomime season coming up, so feel free to let rip. Between 2013 and 2017, I was a fracking lobbyist. Ooh. Correct. I wouldn't recommend doing it. It's not great for your mental health. However, you do learn a huge amount. And the entire 4 years I spent there, didn't actually see a well drilled. So, yeah. It's funny, actually, in the current job I do, I talk a lot more about the experiences of this than I ever did at the IET, because doing any kind of activity onshore around people, particularly energy, you get huge amounts of misinformation, you get huge amounts of misunderstanding, and you get extreme passion on both sides. So it's It's actually been a very good experience, and I wouldn't swap it. Definitely wouldn't go back to it because it's quite miserable. So why onshore wind? We'll do a little bit about the benefits. It's cheap, low cost. It's one of the lowest cost renewables. It's when you can do it, it's quick to put up. If you think about how difficult it is to put something in the sea, this will be on land. It can lower energy bills. We'll get onto a little bit about the impact that certain activities have had on energy bills with onshore wind. And at the moment, when we're looking at the gas crisis and we're looking at Russia, it can also improve energy security. But there's quite an important thing that I've missed as to why onshore wind is incredibly important, and that's partly why it's around people. And that is because it is an incredible marketing tool. That's the Open University, that's Mercedes, that's Budweiser. If you don't like lager, they also do pale ales. That's smart meters. That is the government advert. Albert Einstein, very expensive Albert Einstein is that little dot there. That one winds me up, and you'll find out why the government use onshore wind for advertising. And of course, if you have political ambitions, oh sorry, I missed this one. Great to have little turbines in the background to show how green you are. If anyone's got good eyesight, that says HS2. So we don't really want to be associated with that. And then if you have political ambitions, they're great for photo opportunities to stake your claim as a potential future leader in a year or so. It's important though, because they are very visible. They are something that exists in and around the community, and they are often talked about as the future. It's always important, and this is where marketing meetings get together and put kids in turbines, brilliant, shows the future. Scottish girl, wind turbines, and as you have a marketing meeting potentially, and someone's come up with a good idea, you can do kids and wind, and you can have them blowing a wind turbine, but they've all thought of that before. So it's quite engaging. It's an engaging technology to use, and they move as well. Solar panels don't move. So before we get into how we build more onshore wind, it's important, I think, to look at what the current landscape of onshore wind is across the UK. The few important things to notice from this graph. First one is that we start here all the way in 1992. That's the first commercial wind farm in the UK, which means that we've entered our 4th decade of onshore wind, not particularly new. Other things to notice is this giant dip. We'll get on to why there's a big giant dip there, but that's quite a big issue. And the other third thing to notice is I joined our UK about here, and so everything's getting a lot better now. So I've done a very, very good job. Hopefully. That's getting very close, and we mentioned 30 gigawatts. We'll talk about that later, but that is very close to 15 gigawatts. We are any day now about to break the 15 gigawatt onshore wind barrier, which is quite a nice big target, to be honest, with the industry. And that power is enough. That's enough power for 9.5 million homes, and it provides around 11% of the UK's electricity needs. How that breaks down is interesting. You see a huge amount here, and if you remember from the screen before, what the colours mean. The green's operational, so that's all the stuff that already exists, and you can see the huge amount of progress and development up in Scotland and a bit in Wales. Now, with slides, you always want to try and make it nice and fit together, but it's genuinely impossible to get that graph without covering the map, because as you can see from this, Scotland is taking the huge brunt of the onshore wind in the UK, and there's a very good reason for that. It's a lot windier in Scotland, and there are far fewer people. Again, we'll get on to this bit in a minute. So that's the landscape in the UK, and the important thing to recognise there when we talk about how we build more onshore wind is that planning as an issue is devolved. So each of those countries deals with planning in a different way, which means what I'm not going to do in this is go through every single country individually, because that would be quite dull. What I'm instead going to do is just sort of talk about each of them and then use them as potentially good examples and bad examples. So a bit more interesting than going, and this is what they do in Scotland, and this is what they do in Wales. So we've got to the question, so what do we need to do to build more onshore wind? And the first bit is the ability to actually build it. That man there, David Cameron, in 2015 decided that he was fed up with onshore wind farms being built and enough was enough. Driven by this view that we were seeing more and more turbines in Tory heartlands and areas where his voters were rebelling against them, he decided to bring in what we call a de facto ban. And there's a subtlety in that. It wasn't a ban like it was for a moratorium. There was some very subtle wording and planning, which we'll have a look at in a second, which meant that onshore wind, as you can see, and this is 2015, absolutely tanked. That is completely destroying an industry, literally overnight. Smart people here will notice 2016 and 2017, quite a lot of building. Those are projects that had planning permission already prior to 2015 and were just getting built in 2016 and 2017. But that is quite a stark drop, I think it's fair to say. So how did they do it? So one footnote on page 46 of the National Planning Policy Framework, which is local planning, and also taking out onshore wind from the nationally significant infrastructure program. Yeah, nationally significant infrastructure program. I think it's program. The NSIP regime, which means that basically before anything above 50 megawatts could go to the Secretary of State, and that would get decided, and anything underneath would be done by town and country planning. The reasoning for this was that a lot of the sense was that a lot of communities felt outside of the decision-making process, and that you were getting decisions taken away from you, and it was all done from central government. So they did that, and they added this one 69-word footnote. So things to look at for this. This basically puts in two hurdles. First thing, obviously also worth putting in, repowering's out of it, but a proposed wind energy development, which is one or more turbines. So it's a turbine. And also what this also means is anything above 11.1 meters. 11.1 meters is very small. So first of all, any turbine basically has to be in an area identified as suitable for wind energy development in the development plan. So that puts the onus on the local authority to decide where to put wind. Spoiler alert, not a huge amount of local authorities did that work. Now that's a combination of not necessarily understanding it, not having the resource to do it, not having the technical expertise, not wanting to do it is also one. And we've had academics and some of the people we work with survey local authorities to ask them kind of what they feel about it now. And a lot of the feedback is we just like to understand a little bit more and a bit more clarity, and it's very difficult wording. The other thing to notice in that is that it is only using the development plan, and the development plan only gets updated every 5 years. And a lot's changed from 2015, 2018 to now. We, for example, have brought in legally binding net zero targets. The second part, and this one's very annoying, is the word fully. So following consultation, it can be demonstrated that the planning impacts identified by the local affected local community have been fully addressed, and the proposal has their backing. Now, I don't know if there are planning lawyers in the room. I think there probably is one. Fully. What's fully addressed mean? How would you define fully addressed? How many people, maybe?
All.
Basically, yes. One person can block a wind farm on that. One person, because it hasn't been fully addressed. It's very clever language. So that, in interpretation and clarity, basically meant, yeah, one person can block a wind farm. So those 69 words, effectively, as we said, kill that industry. The only turbines, the little ones that we saw there, sort of single turbine projects, pretty much that farmer or that business would have to go around to every single house in that area, knock on the door and say, I know you don't like it, but can you please listen to me, and spend time going through every single person in the community, because it was genuinely one person has the ability to block a wind farm. The impact of that, and this was based on prices from 2022, 23. So when the gas price went up, and this is a carbon brief thing, their estimation in terms of the amount that the industry in England dropped, the amount of stuff that could have been built, for example, that had a £5.1 billion impact on UK bill payers, which translates to about £182 on your bill, and your bill, and your bill, and your bill. Actually, no, you live in France, and not your bill. But yeah, it's a massive impact. So that's 69 words. So roughly £74 million a word impact. Now, I don't want to be mean to the rest of the words, because I don't think that and there did that. But that one has a lot to answer for as a word. So that's kind of where we were up until about February 2022. February 2022? Yeah, February 2022, when I think, cast your mind back, we had Boris Johnson as Prime Minister. And he, following the war in Ukraine, put together a British energy security strategy. And it started to open the door to potentially seeing onshore wind coming back in England. There was a commitment in there to do some consultation around planning and a commitment to do some consultation around community benefit. Then it got unbanned for a bit when we had Liz Truss, which was a massive surprise. And then Rishi came in and it was sort of not banned again. Well, no, it was sort of banned again. But we went back to where we were in February 2022. So cast your mind forward. It's December 2022 now, and we've recommitted to doing the consultation. Brilliant. Consultation was done. We said just treat it like everything else. Remove that footnote, please. That would really, really help. It can't be easier to build a waste incinerator than an onshore wind turbine. That seems mad. And now we've ended up with this. Same page, 2 footnotes. Don't read it all because there's a weird bit. So that sort of says similar kind of stuff. There's a couple of bits that are repeated, but the 2 hurdles remain. The first bit now has an extra bit which talks about supplementary planning documents, which are actually the bits up here. So now it's not just a local plan. You can do it through a local development order, a neighbourhood development order, a community right to build order. So that's good. So there's more options. Not a lot of people know how they work, and not a lot of people have used them for a while. There's certain projects they haven't got used for, but it's still put the local authority, the onus on the local authority to help and identify areas where they may not have the technical expertise to do that. What does appropriately mean? How many people is appropriately? Nor do I. It's ridiculous. So, according to planning lawyers, and we talked a huge amount to the government at this point, that is a more permissive term. Well, it's definitely more permissive than fully, but it's more permissive than some of the ones that were put ahead of that. But what that still does is leaves things open to interpretation. So you're still asking the local authorities to do quite a lot of work, and you're still having to interpret what the level of support. And so it's gone from the proposal has their backing to the proposal has their community support. So there's still 2 hurdles that were there, and they're probably now about there. And the impact of that is, of course, if you're trying to do business and you like to have a certain environment and you haven't done any business in an area for 8 years because the market's been killed, that's quite difficult to go to your shareholders or go to your board, wherever they may be, and say, yeah, I think they're up for it. They really want it. They're well up for onshore wind, because I don't know. That's quite difficult to back. So yeah, so the ability to read it. One thing to just highlight on the National Planning Policy Framework is that this is a footnote on a page 46, chapter 14, and chapter 14 is called Planning for Climate Change. So in the Planning for Climate Change section, it takes out quite a key technology to address climate change, which I find quite annoying as well. Yes.
So, roughly what does it mean by the local community? Is that like a village, that a town?
That's another good question, because that's leaving it open. So how do you define a community? It's another really good question. It's a lot of things that have to be answered before you do stuff. That is something that developers have to work on whenever they do it. In Scotland, you have that. It can be as simple as the people who can see it. It can be as simple as, for example, in Wales, you have some valleys where you have turbines at one end of the valley and you can see a lot further. So it might be the people who can see it. You may end up with one person, you may end up with 100,000 people, but it's all part of the process of going through with a developer where you do your community engagement. And we'll get onto community engagement in a bit. But it's a really good question, and it's exactly the kind of questions that I get asked by developers to say, how do we do that? Yeah. Is it 1 person, 10 people? Is it a survey? Do I have to run a referendum? We don't want a referendum. We definitely don't want local referendums. And this is planning in England, to be fair. So England is different. What you also need to build onshore wind is an ambition to build it. And we go back to that investment certainty perspective. So we have an ambition to get to 30 gigawatts by 2030 because it gives you something to aim for. It gives companies something to say, right, this is what we're backing. We know what we need for that in terms of supply chain skills, the amount of turbines we might need, and it helps to focus minds. I know people have different opinions on ambition, you can miss them, etc. But we believe it's a useful thing to have as a focus. That is an industry target. That's not a government target. What they do have in Scotland, however, is a 20 gigawatt by 2030 target, which is brilliant. So 3 very important documents that came out of Scottish government, which help to give you that ambition and give you that certainty that they care about you and they want to build. The first one being the onshore wind policy statement, which basically says, yeah, we want onshore wind. There's a number of things you have to do, but we want it and we want to have a target. The second one, and this is where you go into supportive planning regimes, is a updated national planning framework 4. So in England, it's the NPPF, and here it's the NPF4. Horrible. But that is planning for net zero, and that is genuinely planning for climate change. The difficulty is, of course, that resources are a challenge in Scotland. There is ambition to do timescales and get stuff through, but there are not enough planners anywhere. So if anyone wants to become a planner, you will be paid very well. I really cannot emphasize that, become a planner. And the third piece is, and this has been a long time coming, but an onshore wind sector deal for Scotland. And that is industry working with government on a sector deal which says, right, you give us some planning, we'll provide a factory that will do recycling of blades. If you help this, we'll help that. So that's been hashed out over the time. So that is now a vision that exists for onshore wind in Scotland. The slight challenge that the Scottish government have is that there are some key issues that we're going to address later on that they don't have control over because planning is devolved. They can do planning, but there are a lot of other levers, industrial strategy and stuff like that, which they don't really have the ability to control. So if you were a pessimist, which I'm not, you could say there's not a huge amount the Scottish government can actually offer industry. However, planning is definitely one of them. So we've got our ambition to build, great. What does the actual cumulative pipeline? So we talked about that 15 gigawatts earlier, which is where we are now. 22, yeah, about 15 gigawatts. We do need to see quite a bit go through. And again, not to toot my own trumpet since I've been at RUK, but this red bit has got a lot bigger, which is good news. So we're seeing more things go through development. So that's very much in the early stage. It hasn't gone into planning yet. Those are projects, public projects that we know about. This is as soon as it's gone into planning. And this is when it's actually being consented and it can start to look at finance. So this is growing, which is great. But what you'll notice is that a lot of it's pushed that way. And what the trend that we're starting to see is that those projects that we might have snuck into 2030 are coming this way a bit, just thanks to delays and some of the other things that we'll look at in a minute. One thing you may also notice, because you're bright, is that this starts to go down. And the reason for that is because we started building here, we're starting to lose some of that, and it's coming off the system. So one of the important things we have to do is have a planning regime that's fit for what we call repowering, which is taking the site that already has the wind on it and basically keeping the wind on it. And that is through new, go on, yes.
This graph saying that we're not building any wind additionally, it's just planning and
yeah, so
but it's not actually being built.
So that's 2023. And so this is this is plateaued a little bit. So you remember we saw the drop off. So this is the cumulative impact. And then what we're saying is that this is what we could get if we just need to turn all of this into operational. And this tends to be, so the way that our modelling works at RUK is that this is based on when we think it will be commissioned. But of course, everything slips. And so things will move that way. The encouraging thing is that this is the stuff that's under construction. It's not a grey graph because that will move to light green. And then all these things will move down. But what we're effectively looking at is that's what's under construction right now. So by the end of 2024, we'll be at whatever that is, a smidge over 15. And then if everything goes through and everything is brilliant, we'll hit 30 gigawatts by 2031-ish. But there's a high likelihood that some of that will be refused, some of that won't go through, and a lot of it will go that way. And this stuff has to get financed as well.
Is that assuming it's connected to the grid?
Very good. Yes. So there is some modelling about the length of time it takes to get grid connection, but that again is one of the massive issues that we have. It's the grid connection speed. And so we use publicly available data on where they are in the connection queue for this, but what we are starting to see is some slip. And if you, for example, are in planning and you get your planning application approved and then it goes to judicial review, or you get stuck in a big long system that delays it, you may lose that grid connection. And that's when stuff gets pushed right over. And from what I'm hearing from some of these development projects up at the moment, they are getting offered 2039 as a connection date. So the newest projects that are coming through to development are getting pretty late grid connections. Like I said, you have to be able to pay for it. So what you need to create is an attractive investment environment. We're lagging behind a little bit at the moment, and you referred to it in terms of AR5. So the mechanism that we have in this country, on the whole, for funding renewables is the contracts for difference auction. And so that is a guaranteed contract for the amount of power that you're creating. This is where you'll find out I'm really not an economist. The amount of power that you're creating that you have to deal with the government. Onshore wind was essentially taken out of being eligible for the contracts for difference until AR4. So that was one of those, again, another thing on top of it that meant onshore wind really had no route to market for their projects. AR4, which I think was 2020, blends into one, 2021 or 2022, did allow onshore wind back. And I think we cleared around 700 megawatts of projects. The reason that the most recent auction, which was the one last year, which you may have seen in the news where no offshore wind bid in, was basically that this price that they set, the government asked, was far too low. And because they hadn't taken into account between AR4 and AR5 that there'd been huge increases in supply chain costs and the gas price, all that kind of stuff, they basically offered a contract that was completely unsustainable. Not only unsustainable for developers, but completely unsustainable for supply chain companies, turbine manufacturers, just anyone you're trying to get to build your project to actually get it built and make any money. So what we have seen more recently is that in AR6, so that's the one that's just been announced, I think last week, that's auction round 6, our very hard lobbying, and we did say for AR5 that it needs to be higher, but they didn't make it higher. AR6 is now a sustainable price. So we've seen an increase on the contract offer of about 25%. Yes.
What's the time scale?
Time scale of the contract, I believe, is 15 years. 15 years, it is. Thank you. Yes.
Guardian, talking about wind subsidies.
Yes.
Is there any subsidy in that?
Not if you stay above that. If you stay above that line, you're paying back. Strictly speaking, subsidy is a funny word for it. It really, really is, because if you drop below that, difference is paid to the generator. So you could say that's a subsidy. But we haven't seen, so the way that the wholesale gas price, the wholesale energy prices, which is electricity, is sort of up here at the moment, unless it drops, you're not, the government isn't paying you.
But when it's above,
yeah,
pay back to the government.
Yeah.
So you've subsidised the government or whatever. I mean, is there any attempt to balance either side of that line so there is no subsidy? I mean, there are people out like me around who go around saying wind is the cheapest. I can't say that if there's a big subsidy.
Yeah. It's a complex one, and this is why the CFD is a complex way of doing it. But what you're trying to do is the focus there is about the certainty to build your project. And so you're getting offered basically a price for your power for a significant amount of time. And there will be ups and there will be downs. Now, at the moment, everyone's winning. But it has to be at a sustainable level. If it drops below, it is subsidized. But if you think about oil and gas, they get huge tax breaks because the capex cost of oil and gas is so high. So the capital expenditure, so building the thing is very, very high. So you could argue that they're getting subsidies as well, but it's called tax breaks. And so a lot of the subsidy is about a narrative piece. It gets very annoyingly complicated, and it is one of the things that we on the comms side get hammered on. Well, not hammered on, but it's a very complex kind of explanation piece. But in the world that we are at the moment, and particularly with the cost of renewables going down over years and years and years and years, basically got to the right level at AR4, you got to the bottom level at AR5. It has to come up and it has to be more sustainable. But we're living in an electricity price at the moment up here. There are a lot going on with REMA and market reform that needs to happen. It's an imperfect system.
Sorry, one more question on this. Could you identify how much subsidy has been given to wind, if any?
Somebody very clever has a model, and I know they do.
I don't want a model.
But someone has worked it out.
No, I want an actual statement that says there has been no subsidy because it's never gone below the line.
It has gone below the line, I would imagine. I haven't gone that far back, I must confess. It's not why I said I wasn't an economist, but if there are numbers out there, give you our economists detail.
Can I ask you this? Because in previous auction rounds,
Yeah.
the guaranteed price in the CFDs is public knowledge. Right?
Yeah.
And market prices is public knowledge. And so it should be relatively straightforward just to look historically and see what the net amount of money the generators have received is versus the net amount of money that they've paid. And then the difference between the two is the subsidy.
Yeah, I haven't got that figure to hand, I'm afraid. But I know that people have done that. I was worried that this was going to be the one that everyone else.
But there's another factor in there, which is that if the market price is above this point, then there's also the windfall tax.
Yeah,
The
which
windfall
is
tax eliminates a large proportion of the profit above the line.
yeah,
But for all the oil and gas, they can offset their capital expenditure against the windfall tax, which is why
Yeah.
people say that 9 out of 10p in North Sea exploration is paid for by the taxpayer, whereas
yeah.
renewables can't offset their capital allowances against.
Yeah, so the autumn statement is the most recent autumn statement has removed that windfall tax, which is good news. I suppose if you're in that kind of capitalist, if you're talking about capitalism, you would want that renewable profit to be then pumped back into reinvesting, which needs to build more renewables. So that has been a bit of a kick in the teeth for UGL, and the way that it's been done in relation to oil and gas as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, was there another question at the back?
No, I'm kind of to that point. I do think that it's critical to also consider subsidies for this whole discussion.
Mm.
I don't think we can talk about fossil fuel subsidies for renewables.
Yeah, exactly. And the market getting to fit and making it an attractive investment is very complex, and you have to be able to encourage investment because let's not forget when, particularly in England, when the moratorium came in and the 8-year ban came out, a hell of a lot of businesses, particularly little turbine manufacturers, went out of business. So we're now relying heavily on turbines, for example, that come from Europe. And so it has to be, and we are not an island, well, we are an island, but we're not an island in terms of the fact that we are competing with other markets. Let's move on from this slide very quickly, although I will say one good thing about onshore wind, and what we're starting to see is that there are opportunities for companies to do PPAs. That's power purchase agreements. That's where a company is essentially buying, rather than the government buying it, the company's buying it for a consistent level. And we're starting to see a lot more opportunity for that because the size of the projects is smaller. Yes.
Just on that turbine thing,
Yes.
do you know how many wind developers are actually from the UK? Does the wind business stay in the UK or does it go?
I would say in terms of developers and then our membership, wholly UK, probably 4 or 5, not many. You've got big state companies like that and Power Media. You've got the turbine manufacturers, European. They are all pretty much looking at other markets. Yeah, there's a number of reasons for that. But you're also sort of looking at an onshore wind market that's probably not big enough to sustain companies that just look at certain one market. That question there, yeah. Yeah, so that is through, I believe it is through Energy Build, yeah. I'm not an economist, so I can't, I'm afraid. I can get you someone that can, but I wouldn't want to give you crap information. But we are starting to see a PPA market increase in the UK as more people are looking off the back of very, very high energy prices. It's a method basically for them to not have to build their own renewables. Moving very quickly on, you also need a supply chain, you need people to build it. This is our prediction for what 30 by 30 would provide. So you're looking onshore and specifically the model looking at about 27,000 full-time jobs, and a decent amount of gross value added. But it's a massively important part of actually having an industry is that investment certainty so that you can, as a supply chain company, actually go, yeah, there's a market here in onshore wind. I'm going to invest. I'm going to put my time and effort in. And that goes from the people who make turbines to the person who is thinking about what they do with whether they expand their hotel in Scotland, because they might actually have people who are going to come and build stuff and work there. It can go the whole way through, but without the certainty and the confidence that things will get built, it's very difficult to make that kind of decision. Actual turbines is an important part of building onshore wind. So we sort of touched on it a little bit already. But the wind industry, the turbine industry should be booming, but it isn't. And that's partly because there has been this huge push to drop that price, and that CFD price particularly, it's just gone poof, 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 poof. And essentially the turbine manufacturers have been kind of running a loss for quite a few years. That's a massive challenge because, like I said, we don't have a turbine industry in the UK. We probably have in our membership people that do onshore wind turbines, Siemens, Vestas, Nordex, Vensis, Enercon, and they all have other markets to go to. And then you're also, and this is an interesting area that is developing, is you're also seeing competition from Chinese turbine manufacturers. And that adds in a whole host of fun geopolitical questions and market competition questions and European market. And those are the conversations that are happening not just in the UK, but also in the European Union at the moment. And so part of the push from us to say the CFD price for AR6 has to increase is because their supply chain costs, their steel costs, etc., have gone up. And without what we call sustainable pricing, there is a real danger that they would either not sell to the UK or go out of business. And that would be an absolute nightmare. Good point to think and take turbines back to planning and what the impact of an 8-year hiatus on onshore wind has been between 2015 and 2023 is turbine technology has moved on quite a long way. That big turbine that we saw, I was standing outside like that, is an offshore wind turbine, 12 megawatts, 260 meter tip height. That's the biggest turbine. That's literally just been put in last year, despite everything, in Bristol. Brilliant project, single turbine, powers a housing estate. Really, really wonderful example of what onshore wind can do. It's 150 meter tip height. Well, it's actually 149.5 meter tip height, because if you go above 150, you have to do aviation lighting, and people hate a blinky light. That's the biggest turbine in England. We've got turbines now in Sweden, for example, where you're looking at 7 megawatt turbine. There's probably about 200, 250 meter tip height. That is a very efficient turbine. That is modern technology. We're going to have a very grown-up conversation in England if it comes back about A, what's acceptable in terms of planning, but also, and bearing this bit in mind, what's actually going to be available to buy. Because if we're the only country that are asking for turbines that are that size or smaller, there aren't going to be any to buy. So we genuinely have quite a grown-up conversation about the size of turbines. And the way that I would frame that is to say, that's a lot more powerful. You have to make the best use of the wind resource and the land that you have available. And in my mind, that would be using the best, most modern technology, but it would also, and most appropriate technology, but it would also be about using co-located batteries, storage, green hydrogen, so that you are, like I say, using the best use for the energy system of the technology available. This is where we get to somewhere to connect it to, because you can go through all of this, and then you won't have a grid connection, which is a massive problem. We're moving in the UK from a centralized, I'm talking to people who know a lot more about this. I can feel it in the room, so I apologize. But we're moving from a centralized electricity system to a decentralized one. There has been a choose my words carefully, chronic underinvestment in the grid, to the extent that we are really struggling. There are housing developments in West London that can't get a grid connection. That's not great. One of the key reasons for this, and one of the things that we've been lobbying very hard on, is because Ofgem's remit has been all about bill payer, has had the bill payer and the cost of stuff at the heart of it. And they're the people that make the decisions about how you build grid and where you build grid. So one of the key things that we've done is we've lobbied very hard with a load of other organisations to embed a net zero remit into Ofgem. So using the 2019 Net Zero Act, you can basically say to Ofgem, right, you can use net zero as a reason to build grid. What that has unlocked is the ability to make anticipatory investment. Instead of them saying, I want to build this here so I can connect a bunch of onshore wind in the future over there, and they go, it's going to cost a lot, it's going to add bill pay, we can't do it. You can say, it'll be very good for hitting net zero targets, we need to have that. And honestly, if we don't do it now, it's going to cost a shed load more in the future. So it's worth, I mean, that's been quite a big shift. And I'd say in the last year or so, the amount of politicians I've spoken to and heard talk about grid has gone from 1, and if anyone's met Alan Whitehead, 1 to actually quite a few. I mean, we had grid infrastructure in the King's speech, which is bizarre, but pretty unprecedented. So it's definitely moving up that agenda. But at the moment, we are still seeing a lot of projects being delayed from being brought on because they can't get grid connection. There's a nice picture of a T-pylon. I quite like pylons now as well. I'm actually quite worried that I'm becoming a prosper now. This is a good point to bring up Wales. Wales' onshore wind has stuttered quite a bit. It's got one really big wind farm, I think somewhere around there, which is Penny Camoys, very big wind farm. And since then, it's sort of been really sporadic, and we've not seen anything for quite a while. One of the big reasons for this, and there's a huge amount of development here, all of these yellow ones, is that there is basically no grid in mid Wales. And so there has to be a huge grid building project in mid Wales if we want to connect what is actually quite a decent opportunity for Wales and onshore wind. So working with Welsh Government is key. And we've actually got to the point that one of our member developers has decided they've got quite bored about waiting for National Grid to build them a grid. So they're now building their own grid. And that's quite hard, quite a big challenge. But it's got to that level because there is huge potential in Wales. And the other thing to talk about, very briefly, is the connection queue. It's massive. So this is putting your project into a queue to get connected. That connection queue is now around, the backlog is I think about 600 gigawatts, because it's not just generation, there's loads of little battery projects in there and loads of people putting their projects into that queue to just hold it. And so what that has had is a real impact again on the delay that you've had for your project going through. So it's been encouraging, and I haven't had a chance to read it yet because it was all coming out on Sunday night and on Friday night and all this kind of stuff. But there is a huge amount of documentation coming out of the government this week and last week about plans for the grid, connection queue reform, spatial planning for grid, and you may have all seen that headline around £1,000 for community benefit for a pylon. That's a very interesting conversation, which we can get onto in a bit. The one thing that we do need them to look at a little bit more is it's all very well thinking about the queue for the future. There's a massive queue behind that they need to sort out as well.
600 gigawatts.
Yeah.
So there's that multiple projects being repeated.
There's just because there's loads of battery projects. The capacity in that queue is huge. So it's things that might have gone in. It's a huge amount of battery projects in there as well.
Okay.
So
defining community for the £1,000.
fortunately, that's National Grid's problem. Actually, weirdly, a little bit easier for a thing, because if you think about I'm quite keen to make sure that when we talk about grid community benefit, we don't start confusing it with any of the community benefit that gets paid for onshore wind, because it's it's harder to do. I think personally, you need to think about grid infrastructure like a train line or something like that. It's linear, so it's much easier to do. Right, it's this many people around the pylon, and it's a different regime. But I think there's suggestions in there, and there were suggestions in the Nick Windsor report about a certain amount of households that were on the land and they just could see it. So it's when you put the thread of community benefits, it gets complicated very, very quickly. Yeah. And there's a lot of people that have, a lot of politicians particularly, who have very good ideas about it and don't necessarily understand the complexity. So at this point, we've got to how we build more onshore wind. They're supportive and well resourced, so you need planners. I really can't emphasise, we don't have enough planners in the industry. There's definitely not enough planners in the local authorities. So well resourced planning system. Someone I was talking to the other day said, we can make planning more sexy if we call them placemakers. So maybe we need loads of placemakers, but I don't know if that's going to actually help. Ambition and political will, and it would be nice to have a UK target. Money and investment, a thriving supply chain, turbines, grid. What have I forgotten? You said people. Yes, people. Very good. And you said people, which is good because I was worried someone was going to say community, and then it wouldn't work. Yeah, people, massive, massive, massive part of it. And you will notice from that everyone's smiling, and that's not the case because in a community you have people that don't like them. You have people that do like them and will protest. Not very many. You have people that don't mind the turbines but don't like the pylons. That's a new one. That's quite frustrating because I think we've got somewhere with the turbines, but all of that associated infrastructure is what people have a problem with. And on a point about infrastructure, it costs 8 to 12 times more expensive to bury the cable. So where's that bill? Where that go on people's bills? And so we'll see if people want that. You've also got conspiracy theorists in your community probably, but then you've also got people who really, really desperately want to save the planet. But, and this is probably the most difficult part, is that most of the community don't care and they can sit on their phones all the time. So how do you talk to that bit in the community as well? So you've got quite a complex task with the people element of onshore wind, and that's kind of why it's such a good marketing tool because people can see it. This is polling that we did recently, and helps to understand kind of where onshore wind fits compared to other technology, and that's a very good number, and that's really shifted. I think people understand a lot more about onshore wind. They understand the importance of it. So that 74% has increased incredibly. You'll always have lots of people on polling that say they don't know. That's just the nature of polling. It's relatively decent compared to offshore wind. Solar is always very popular. I think that's probably being challenged at the moment. There's quite a lot of villages in England that are starting to see an interesting backlash on solar because of the commercial scale of solar. And something else to point out is that I ran loads of polls and I never managed to get a number that high for fracking, which is quite frustrating. And then I moved to RUK and I suddenly get a 34% approval rating. So yeah, I don't know how that managed. We did this in October last year, and that is a constituency level. So we did 6,000 people. I think you need 1,000 people to make it BBC worthy and representative. That's 6,000, and that meant that we could do proper constituency breakdown, which meant we could have headlines like that, which is onshore wind is more popular with conservative voters than everybody's realised, which is really, really interesting. And it sort of goes against that perception. We did another more recent one that suggests that 4/5 back green growth, a little bit more odd concept. It's easier to poll about something like, do you like that wind turbine? But green growth in general, and see green growth in the green economy as the future. Yeah, that's the every constituency, and it shows strong support pretty much. I mean, everywhere. The lowest we got for support in constituency was about 64% somewhere in Wales, and the highest we were getting sort of 95% in onshore wind, and that was in constituencies where you couldn't build it.
There'll be incremental information on where those turbines or solar farms be built.
No, because there are a lot of constituencies there's nothing in the planning, you can't build them. But that's a good point, because one of the biggest challenges you have is that people like the concept, but then when it comes into their life, how do you sort that out? There's a famous one that we used to talk about a lot in the fracking industry, which was that if you ask people if they are for the measles, mumps, the MMR vaccine, the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine, it's like 96%. Bearing in mind, vaccine politics has changed a little bit. And then you go, would you give it to your child? It goes down to like 70. It's an interesting kind of thing that you just have to kind of do the engagement with. And the other polling that we've done, and it's consistently done, and that others have done in the industry, is that popularity for a wind farm in an area once it's built, on the whole, actually tends to increase. So people get used to it, people like it, people see the benefit that it brings to the community. So it's getting over that hurdle for planning and then seeing it grow. But what has been interesting over the last few years is to see that kind of social necessity and the understanding with it, net zero, with climate change, etc., to see onshore wind go up. It's more popular than pizza. That's a very good stat. And that's based on 2 different pollings. It's sort of not really there, but it is. And then my favourite tweet in the world was from my colleague Luke, who did a non-comprehensive list of things less popular than onshore wind. Favourites include Winston Churchill, Soup, Spain, and Beyonce, which is massive. That was a big win. So it's popular. This is a lovely little slide that a colleague of mine put together after a workshop where we were doing exactly that exercise about how we demonstrate local community support. So we've established that on the whole, wind farms are more popular than they were before. But that question that we have in England about demonstrating local support is extremely difficult. And we asked, like we said, we asked about 80. You can ask anybody and someone will come up with a different excuse, a different brief, and a different definition. So what does that term really mean? What does local support mean? What is community? And again, it all comes down to you as a developer having to do the work in your local community, understanding the local people that are in their area, talking to them and working out what they think their community is, for example. Because it's all very well me going and saying, that's your community. And they go, well, no, it's not. You've forgotten about those people or those people. It's also very difficult to work out how you do it and you don't leave people out. So, like I said, the majority of people are on their phone. How do you engage younger people who are not going to go and sit in a planning meeting? Because a planning meeting on the whole tends to be the same kind of person. They talk a lot in government sort of legislation and best practice about digital engagement. There's good bits and bad bits for that. But are you genuinely going to build an entire digital engagement platform for a single turbine project? Probably not worth it. If you do, and this is where the bit we get to community benefits, every single pound you spend here makes the project more expensive, which fundamentally makes the electricity more expensive. Now, a lot of that money is very valuable money to spend to bring on the community, but it is always worth bearing that in mind that everything makes things more expensive, and it fundamentally makes all of our energy bills more expensive. So in the example of England, I think the best way to go is to demonstrate best practice of community engagement, to focus, as we've said, on the engagement part, not necessarily the benefit, but we'll talk about the benefit in a minute. And again, even for this, it comes down to policy clarity. We've talked about investment certainty for businesses, but if you're a local community and you start seeing stories come out and saying, oh, onshore wind back in England, it's coming, it's coming, it's coming. If you're left in that unclear space where there is no good information that's coming in to say exactly that question, is it coming too close to where I am? That breeds misinformation, that breeds worry, that breeds fear. That also breeds hope. People want stuff. There's community benefits available. So having policy clarity and showing what good looks like and showing what could be available to you if you let onshore wind into your community is a massively important part of it. So I quite like that one. That's quite a nice one. And as you said, local referendums can be really challenging and it takes a lot of time. So when we want to define community support, don't want to be going down that route. Yeah, I've got 5 minutes. Lovely. Community benefits. That's almost a sickeningly lovely one, but that's a lovely one. Community benefits. So we reckon, we did a survey that we give about £75 million a year as the onshore wind industry across the UK as community benefits. That's a hell of a lot of money that goes on to local projects, that goes on to schemes within a village, schemes within the community. There is a bit of there's a bit of a stereotype that it only goes to sort of repairing the church roof or repairing the village hall. That may have been the case before, but there are a lot of developers working very hard on more strategic projects. So we saw, particularly in the COVID pandemic, one of the benefits of having community benefit funding from a wind farm is that it's much more easily accessible. So they were able to roll out COVID-19 funding short notice to help people within their community. The breakdown on that, just in case anyone's interested, about 55 million in Scotland, 10 in England, 6.5 in Wales, and 3 in Northern Ireland. So if you think about, we're at 15 gigawatts now, and if we get to 30 gigawatts, that's potentially doubling that to £150 million a year. That's a significant amount of money for local communities that have potentially, and particularly in rural areas, potentially been underfunded. So not only have we talked about all the great benefits that onshore wind brings, the bills, energy security, net zero, but we're also funding everyone's local services. That's great.
Temperature of the prices.
I haven't done that research.
Tiny.
It'll be tiny. It will be tiny, but it's important to recognise. I think that. But it's also, if you think about everything on top of that, plus delays and all that kind of stuff, it's an important one. But on a single turbine project, if you're using it for your factory or your farm or whatever, you wouldn't. And this is where it comes down to tailoring it for the project that you're in. You wouldn't be expecting someone to give the same level, for example, of community benefit that you would for a 45 turbine commercial wind farm, or a community wind farm wouldn't provide power for the community and then give community benefit. So again, it gets quite complicated quite quickly, and it has all of those difficult questions about how you define all the bits. Does that answer the question? Sorry, I know you didn't answer the question, but Yeah. So we have a great organisation that I work with called Community Energy England. There's Community Energy Wales. I represent the industry on the top level. That's not that I don't represent community energy, but my worries are, and the things that I would love to be able to see it come through. But then in England, if we're talking about the planning regime, any turbine above 11.1 metres is effectively banned. So you haven't been able to build a community wind farm. That one in Bristol took 7 years. That's disgraceful. That is a community, that is a wind turbine project that is on a housing estate, actively helping that community. It's taken 7 years to build it. That can't be the case. So we're hoping that through the policy change that we're trying to lobby for, alongside a lot of campaigning organisations, community energy union, etc., you're able to get that. Now, the worry that I have is that we do that, and then the community gets really excited, they get funding, they get a project up and running. We go back to my actual turbines point, and they won't be able to get turbines. So my deep drive for doing the job I do is also making sure the community can get that project over the line, and also the industry can provide expertise and help. Are we nearly done with the time, or are we?
Yeah.
I've got like 2 more slides. Okay. So that's what we need to build more onshore wind in all of those things, and community support, which is great. But there's also a couple of other things we have to think about, including road transport, aviation, and lighting for radars, sound, competition from abroad, Germany, the IRA in America, skills, we need all the people that we can do to build it, and a diverse workforce. Birds, so working with birds and wildlife, so biodiversity, so how onshore wind and renewables can work together with the biodiversity net gain targets that different governments and different regimes have. And that also brings us to the last one, which is peatland. And of course, peatland is a massive carbon store. Peatlands are very degraded in the UK. There are huge peatland restoration targets in Scotland and Wales in particular. And our view as an industry, because we've seen it on several very, very good sites, is that onshore wind can be a massive helper in terms of getting people onto sites where we can restore peatland and put money into it. So that site in Wales that I was talking about earlier, Penny Camoid, does amazing things with peat restoration. But you've still got to balance all of that sort of stuff off. So a lot of the land that we will be using potentially will be degraded peat. So to finish, I hope that's been useful. It's been quite whistle stop. I appreciate it. Acknowledge that everyone had the questions about the economics, which is a shame. But I think it's probably worth thinking again about that kind of visual element of it. And then I can't really finish it properly, so I'll let Budweiser finish it and say, be a king, choose renewables, but also do all of that stuff that we need to get it unblocked. But anyway, thank you. So any questions?
Taking the questions on the way. I'm going to take the first question. You talked about planning or placemaking being really important.
Yeah.
But we also hear many local authorities warning they're close to insolvency. How close is this to being a statutory requirement for them to expand their planning team? And where would there be a focus on that?
Exactly. I mean, it's a very, 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 very difficult question because there aren't enough planners. We're expecting to build a huge amount. I mean, I'm just talking about on renewables. I'm talking about onshore wind. I'm not even talking about solar. I'm not talking about housing. There is going to be a massive uptick in requirement. And so there's no easy answer, unfortunately. I mean, one of the things the industry always gets accused of is stealing planners from local authorities. Probably should stop doing that. But we've talked about it, and we're talking about it in Wales, about whether on some of the more specialist services, so some of the ecology services, some of the work on grid planning, or some of the work on the noise, for example, not every local authority has to have a noise expert. And if we can have a bit of a pooled resource, but it stays, I mean, it's the question about whether you keep decision making locally or you do some of the strategic stuff on the NSIP sort of side of it for onshore wind, whether you take that out of local people's hands. It's very, very difficult. That's a very complicated question. But we really do need a properly resourced planning system. And that's going to be the blocker for Scotland.
Can I just ask, there was a question online from, does Renewable UK have a position in terms of what format community benefits should take around a wind scheme?
Yes, we do. It's very complicated, and we think that each community is different, and it has to be done through proper engagement with the local community by the developer working together. Community benefits should be flexible. and we're very, very, very passionate about that because I spoke about kind of people having good ideas, and one of the things that comes up a lot is everybody within an area should have a local electricity discount scheme. Sounds great, very difficult to actually do in practice. It doesn't work in every community. If you think about practical challenges like the number of people who own a house and rent a house, is it only the homeowner, the landowner, the landlord, whatever? What if you have an area that's got 150,000 people in it, and then you got an area with 2 people in it? Do you pay the 2 people's energy bill times 1,000, or do you give every single person in 150,000 a quid? It's not that simple. You have to have it as a flexible approach, but you have to show that there are an incredible amount of a suite of options available. And the other thing you don't want to do is stifle innovation. If you go into a community, and we've had this several times where the developer will go in and say, what does the community want more than anything? And the community says, it's a rural fishing community in Scotland. And they go, the thing that would help us the most is we really need funding for our pier because we can't bring stuff in and out of the village. And so that developer actually worked with them. That was before they even got planning in. So they were just doing this on a promise. They helped them with their kind of commercial team to come up with a funding application and to do all of that kind of work. And they got the pier built. And then if you start to mandate things, then I worry that you go down a very simplistic route and you won't be able to get the subtleties and the variance and the benefit of communication with different communities.
Thank you. I recognise some people need to leave, but if you want to sneak out to this point, Brenda.
James, it used to be said in Oxfordshire that the Ministry of Defence would never let you build on. You haven't mentioned the Ministry of Defence.
No, I rushed it now with the aviation. Yeah.
Well, aviation. All right, I didn't. Aviation. I mean, is it that they've been tamed? That there's better radar? That the Ministry of Defence has shrunk? I don't know what's the situation.
We have a very good relationship with the Ministry of Defence. A lot of that's come from the offshore wind industry. So I've got a head of aviation at work who does a lot of work with the MOD that I'm not allowed to know about or talk about, to be fair. But you're right, it's the radar stuff and more modern radars and having wind, what's the word? Not appropriate, but you know what I mean, wind appropriate radar, because there are significant challenges on older radar systems for how wind turbines show up because they are moving. And so if you have a plane going across, particularly an offshore wind farm, and then it goes like that, and you're only looking top down and it's like, and then you might lose a plane with it. So there's a variety of things. You have better quality radar, and then we work with the MOD to test those. There's putting things in a better line so you can see it going through the line. There's 3D radar. So technology has helped a lot. And yeah, I suppose it's engagement really. Engagement with the MOD and
well, I mean, it used to be don't bother.
Yeah, well, it's definitely not like that anymore. And I think things like legally binding net zero target does help because it's a whole government. It's a government department at the end of the day. It doesn't always feel like every department's on complete ball with it, but that has helped to kind of hold people to account and stuff like that. And they are also a major landowner. So yeah, I wasn't in the industry at the time when that was kind of the perception, but I do know that we have regular conversations with the MOD.
Question.
Yeah. There's a lot of countries in Europe that have a much higher proportion of their power coming from renewables. Is there a reason, or do we know why there's all this opposition in the UK to turbines, pylons, solar farms?
There wasn't any opposition. No. I think there's a misconception. There's definitely a misconception. There was an academic from Oxford Brookes actually who did a whole piece in the Cotswolds and actually went around and interviewed a whole bunch of people, knocked on loads of doors. And the really fascinating thing was that the perception of other people not liking renewables was really, really high. But actually the person didn't mind that much, but it's their view of other people. I think solar is getting built. I think it's a misconception, and the support has grown. I think in Scotland you see a lot of wind, and actually the bigger challenge will be that we may start to have very difficult conversations about the cumulative impact of wind because we are building a hell of a lot of wind in Scotland. And there may be communities, and we've started seeing some communities on the community benefit side saying, well, some people in the community saying, yeah, we already get 6 different funds from 6 different wind farms. We'll just not have the wind farm, the new 7th wind farm. So that's a consideration. Dangerous to start speculating about what makes English people different from.
But aren't 20% of
Europeans.
people against anything at any one time anyway?
There is that. There is a slightly cultural thing, and I don't like using them because I think it's quite.
Well, 20% of people don't like margarita pizza.
Well, also true. So, Beyonce. Well, probably more. Yeah, it's interesting, but I don't know. We're going to have a chat later, aren't we, about different perceptions in moratoriums in various other European countries. And I mean, I go to where my family are in the east of Holland, and there's quite a few people protesting onshore wind there. The hilarious irony is that they're right at the border and there's shed loads of wind turbines in Germany that they can see as well. So that's the life of living on the border. But I think you'll just see a lot more of it. I think we're just probably a bit more aware of it.
The question at the back first.
Yes.
2, 3.
Yeah, I was just, unfortunately, an economics question.
Yeah.
What extent is like market design part of that conversation?
Massive, yeah. So the review of the electricity market and the REMA is huge. I should set you up with my colleague Mike, who's been working a huge amount on REMA. Onshore wind and the CFD is an interesting one because actually in the most recent auction, the AR5 where the offshore wind failed, because they set up AR4 basically to be a pot with onshore wind and solar, a pot with offshore wind, a pot with remote island wind because it's a bit more expensive because the connection charges, and a pot with emerging technology which was floating. And we said that's pretty good. That's you're going to get a good mix. And that, as you can talk about kind of reform of the market, that is about wanting to see a good mix of renewables and also backing emerging tech. What they did in AR5 was they put onshore wind, solar, and offshore wind and remote island wind all in the same pot and basically made the renewables compete with each other. And then because the price is too low, no offshore wind in, but loads of onshore clear. And so what we want to sort of start to see is it not be so competition focused, because that's what's been a huge driver. Is it's lowest cost renewable, best to build, just drive, and start to take into account a lot more other aspects in supply chain and investment and sustainability within the process. And so there's a lot of conversation, very active conversation going on about that at the moment.
Maybe some of the people from Aurora Energy Research listening will be able to answer some questions on that. Charlie, you have a question?
Okay, just a quick comment. Any questions? A comment on the thing why doesn't have England as high density renewables to other country? I mean, it's a very population dense country, England specifically, and also all our national parks are upland, and there's an association between windy places and beautiful places or unspoiled places, which I guess helps us understand the onshore wind bit, but not other really good. But then my question was on, so I was kind of really struck by the points you were making about the need for grid and network improvements to help streamline the connection process. But the grid is also having to work out how to accommodate offshore wind connections, lots of EV charging, some areas like strengthening to accommodate heat pumps and so on. So lots and lots of additional demands on the grid. So I was wondering whether you think that what's being done to stimulate network improvements and investment from whoever it may be is ultimately going to be a bit of a competition between the needs to accommodate heat pumps, EV charging, offshore wind, and then onshore wind, and whether onshore wind might end up at the bottom of the pile.
I think for some of the offshore in England, you're looking at a lot of East Coast, so you can do some grid upgrades and some building there. And some of the onshore wind may not be in the same kind of place. The generation side, I think you need to do it. You need to do it in Scotland. You need to do it in Wales. That they bring other benefits. Because if you're taking grid to mid Wales, you're just needing to put in enough capacity to predict what you will need in terms of heat pump demand and that. But actually using the generation to forecast where you'll need grid, and then also it's an added benefit that you're starting to get grid for the people who live there, particularly in mid Wales where everyone's effectively not on an electric network that they can do heat, for example, they're all on oil heating. I think there's benefits, but it does have to be extraordinarily well planned. I think from the perception of the last year, I think that they are really starting to wake up to that. And from my work with sort of some of the engineers in the IET, that has been talked about. So future power system, all that kind of stuff that has been talked about for decades, is finally starting to see a bit of a not a renaissance, but actual work. And I recommend sort of reading the McWinder report for seeing how that future planning will go. I hope not. I don't think we need to do that kind of thing, but there will be a point when we are making the best use of the kind of the renewables that we have, and then some, for example, some of those older sites that we could repower may not be worth it because they'd be better to free up the space for something else.
I'm just going to try and squeeze in 2 questions. Adam, please, you had a question?
Yes, just so 2 thoughts. First of all, it's kind of bizarre that you talk a lot about the community support, and this is some condition for this is the one thing. And you can build a railway, but you don't give people cheap railway, you give students build roads.
Yeah,
but that's the first point. So I wonder whether playing into that whole narrative is just self-defeating. You're sort of legitimizing it and thinking absurd.
yeah.
You don't have to answer that.
No, it's a very good observation. And it's difficult.
Second, but now I have a question, which is one thing I think about with the transition is the time.
Yeah,
we have a period over the next few years where it's really crucial we deal with issues like we decarbonize our energy, but this isn't necessarily forever. And as you showed with your graph, wind turbines aren't necessarily forever.
no.
They don't make permanent damage to the landscape. And I wondered to what extent you've tried to convey to people that it isn't necessarily forever.
Yeah,
and it can be removed.
It's a narrative that a lot of the developers use. I tend to use it in the sense of saying, well, if you're going to have energy infrastructure, if you think about oil and gas well or a fracking well or whatever, you are decommissioning that by taking the top off and leaving the rest in, and you're completely right. You can just go away. I think the interesting thing on that, because you would say that, but it's quite a negative way of framing it and saying, well, it's temporary, don't worry about it. It'll be gone soon.
It's going to sort this all out in 20 years.
Yeah, but it's funny with the polling to show that people get on board with it and they like it, and actually their view of the wind farm in their local area grows and improves. That, funnily enough, in some areas where they've had a wind farm for a while and they've been benefiting from it, they are actually worried about the end of life and they are asking for it to get repowered because they like it. And so if you'd have set that narrative up initially, it's how you communicate and what that community would be like. But I think the point about not leaving the mark that something else would is a massively important one, and these talked about by developers in the roadshows that they do and some of the others.
So just one more question,
Yeah,
please. Okay.
But maybe a silly question.
Never silly
Just at the end, you were talking about like the impact of like wildlife and wind farms. You sort of see all these things where wind farms kill 10 billion birds or something. And I saw an article saying that if you paint one turbine black, that massively decreases. So one, is that true? I don't know. And then 2, like, is that the sort of wildlife impact you're talking about? Is it literally how many birds fly into the turbine, or is there a broader wildlife?
So there's a few things here. So first of all, I think the wind industry kills about 10,000 odd birds, tens of thousands of birds, and kill 9 million a year. Buildings kill a lot. And the conversations that we have, and I speak to the RSPB very regularly, and do you know what's going to kill more birds? Climate change. And so you sort of go, there is a piece to do it. I mean, that's not to mean that we don't mitigate a lot to do exactly that and to try and minimize it. We do 2-year bird surveys for every kind of project, so you're knowing exactly how it's working. There's obviously differences with offshore wind and onshore wind. The painting the turbine black is a really interesting one, and I was actually having a conversation with a developer yesterday exactly about that. The fun bit with that is that you paint it black and then the planners complain. The planners and the people complain.
You might get more flicker and visual intrusion.
And it does look it does look different.
Yeah.
And it's kind of, there's so many things like that when you're trying to do any kind of infrastructure building where it's sort of like one side wants something, the other side doesn't want that. But the trials are really successful, and the trials are kind of really, really promising for that kind of stuff. So I know that people are really, really looking at it. In terms of other stuff, I think There's a lot more on the offshore side on marine mammals, noise. Seabirds is harder. Avian flu in particular has hit seabirds a lot harder, and so there are lots and lots and lots of work streams and programs looking at exactly how to minimise. And then if you can't minimise, how you do what we call strategic compensation or compensation, where if you've got unavoidably modelled that you'll kill 5 birds, 5 kittiwakes, you'll do something somewhere else to promote the breeding, and then you get 10, 15, 20 extra birds, and it's this.
Well, we're waiting to hear the definition of net biodiversity gain, aren't we?
So it's biodiversity net gain in England, and it's biodiversity net benefit in Wales. So that's an important thing, because they don't like it if you get that wrong in the government.
Sorry if I misspoke there. We'll bring the formal questions to a close, and thanks, James, once again. And thanks to people online as well. So that's it for this term. Just to let you know, we come back first week with Lucy Yu, who is CEO at the Octopus Energy Centre for Net Zero. I hope to see you some of you there then. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I thought it was an hour and a half.